There's a line running through a forest in the Pacific Northwest. You can't see it. No wall, no fence, no sign. Just trees on both sides. The same species, the same soil, the same birds. But step across that invisible line, and you've just left the United States and entered Canada. That line is called the 49th parallel. It was drawn in 1818 by two diplomats sitting in a room in London. Neither of them had ever seen that forest. They just agreed. Here. Right here. This is where one country ends and another begins. And somehow, that agreement, made over 200 years ago by men who are long dead, still controls your life today. Which laws apply to you, which passport you carry, whether you need a visa to visit the country on the other side of those trees. Here's what I want to ask. Why does that line feel real? Because it does feel real. Borders aren't just abstract political concepts. They trigger something deep. Identity, belonging, threat, safety. People fight over them, die over them, build walls over them. And yet, physically, they're nothing. A line, an agreement, a shared story that enough people decided to believe. Today we're going to look at where that story came from. Not the diplomatic history, but the deeper question. What is it about human beings that makes us need lines in the first place? The 49th parallel was drawn in 1818 by diplomats in London who had never seen the forest it runs through. That line still controls your life today. Let's go back to the beginning, way back. 100,000 years ago, there were no borders. Not a single one. Not a fence, not a wall, not a treaty. Just land, and people moving across it. Picture a small band of hunter-gatherers somewhere in what is now East Africa. 20, maybe 30 people. They don't have a fixed home. They follow game, track seasonal fruit, memorize the landscape the way you memorize a neighborhood you've lived in for years. They know where the river floods in spring, where the big herd crosses in autumn, where to shelter when the wind comes from the north. That territory is theirs, but not in the way we mean ours today. There's no deed, no flag, no sign, but there is something, a shared, unspoken understanding. Other groups know this is their range. You don't cross into someone else's hunting ground without a reason, not because of a law, but because it's dangerous, and everyone knows it. Anthropologists call these spaces between groups buffer zones. Nobody's land, places where both sides instinctively stayed away from each other, not out of agreement, but out of mutual wariness. That's not a border, it's something older, a territorial instinct that we share with wolves, with lions, with almost every social animal that lives in groups. Territory is biological before it's political. The interesting question is what turned that instinct into something else. Buffer zones between hunter-gatherer groups, nobody's land, not a border, something older. Territory is biological before it's political. And here's where it gets personal, because I want you to test this on yourself. Think of a place you consider yours, not legally, just personally. A specific bench in a park, a corner table at a coffee shop you go to every week, a spot on the beach where you always put your towel, a section of trail where you never seem to run into other people. Nobody gave you that place. You don't own it, but something in you claims it. Why? Write it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. Where is your place, and what makes it feel like yours? Because I think this instinct, this small, private act of territorial claiming, is the same instinct that eventually built the walls of Jericho, drew the borders of Africa, and divided the Indian subcontinent in 6 weeks. Scale changes. The instinct doesn't. So what actually turned a biological instinct into a political institution? One word: farming. About 10 to 12,000 years ago, in multiple places around the world, independently, at different times, humans stopped moving and started growing. The Fertile Crescent first, then China, Mesoamerica, the Indus Valley. The specifics vary, but the consequence was the same everywhere. When you plant a crop, you can't leave. That sounds simple, but think about what it means. A hunter-gatherer survival strategy is mobility. If one area gets depleted, you move on. The land doesn't belong to you because you don't belong to the land. The relationship is temporary by design. A farmer is the opposite. You break the soil in spring. You plant. You wait through summer. You harvest in fall. And then you do it again next year, in the same field, because you've already cleared it, already learned its drainage patterns, already built a storage structure next to it. You've invested. An investment creates something new, the possibility of loss. Before farming, you couldn't really lose land because you didn't really have land. After farming, you could. Someone could come while you were gone and take your harvest. They could settle in your field. They could destroy in a day what took you a season to build. That fear, that specific new fear of losing something you put your labor into, is where borders come from. Not from politics, not from kings, from farmers. Before farming, no loss. After farming, everything to lose. The border didn't come from kings, it came from farmers. The first physical border we know about isn't a line on a map, it's a wall. Jericho. Around 8000 BCE, on the west bank of the Jordan River, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on earth. By that point, Jericho had a stone wall, a real one, not a palisade of sticks, but heavy stone construction with a tower attached. And inside that wall, grain stores, accumulated labor, seasons' worth of food. The wall wasn't built because Jericho was afraid of armies. It was built because Jericho had something worth taking. That's the shift. Once you accumulate, you need to protect. And once you protect, you need to define what's inside the protection and what isn't. Where does ours end? The Wall of Jericho is the world's first border. Not a line in a treaty, but a line in stone. Not a concept, but an architecture. The next stage came a few thousand years later in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, where the first true cities emerged: Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, each with its own walls, its own ruler, its own territory. And here's something remarkable. These cities fought each other over land, not over people. The dispute between Lagash and Umma, recorded in cuneiform around 2450 BCE, is one of the first documented territorial conflicts in history. Not a raid, not a skirmish over cattle. A formal territorial dispute, complete with treaties, violations, and counterclaims. For the first time, a border isn't just a physical thing. It's a political thing. It defines not just where you live, but what you control, what you're responsible for, who obeys you. And with that comes a new kind of person, a ruler whose power is measured not by strength or charisma, but by territory. How much land falls within your walls? That's who you are. Lagash versus Umma, 2450 BCE, the first recorded territorial dispute. A border stops being a wall and becomes a political claim. But here's something that surprises most people. The Roman Empire, which at its peak controlled about 5 million square kilometers, did not have borders in the way we think of them. Rome had frontiers: the Rhine, the Danube, Hadrian's Wall in Britain. But these weren't lines of sovereignty. They were lines of military deployment. Here is where our legions stand. Beyond this, we don't go. Not because that's another country, just because we haven't gotten there yet. And that distinction matters enormously. Rome didn't believe there were other legitimate powers in the world. Rome was the world. Orbis terrarum, the circle of the lands. Everything outside Rome's reach wasn't a foreign country, it was just territory that hadn't been civilized yet. Given enough time, it would all become Roman. China operated on exactly the same logic. The emperor ruled all under heaven, Tian Sha. Not China, everything. The idea that there could be an equal sovereign power on the other side of a line, that was not a concept the ancient world really had. This is a completely different way of thinking about space. Modern borders are based on the idea that sovereign states are equal. My territory, your territory, a line between us, mutual recognition. Ancient empires had no such concept. There was the empire, and there was the rest. Temporarily uncontrolled territory, not sovereign equals. So when did we get from there to here? Rome didn't have borders. It had frontiers. There was the empire and the rest. Not sovereign equals, just space not yet controlled. The year is 1648. For 30 years, Europe had been tearing itself apart. The 30 Years' War killed roughly a third of the population of what is now Germany. Entire regions depopulated, crops burned, cities sacked. When it finally ended, the exhausted monarchs of Europe sat down in two German cities, Münster and Osnabrück, both in the region of Westphalia, and worked out an agreement. What they agreed to was simple in theory, radical in practice. Every state is sovereign within its own territory. No outside power, not another king, not the Pope, not the Holy Roman Emperor, has the right to interfere in the internal affairs of another state. That sounds obvious to us now. It was not obvious in 1648. For centuries, European politics had been a tangle of overlapping claims. Religious authority, dynastic inheritance, feudal loyalty, where nobody was clearly in charge of anything. The Peace of Westphalia cut through all of that with a single principle. The line on the map is real. What's inside it is yours. What's outside it is not your business. Every time you hear the words sovereignty, territorial integrity, or non-interference in internal affairs, you're hearing 1648. The entire framework of modern international law runs on concepts invented in that peace treaty. The border stopped being a wall or a military line. It became a legal category, a juridical fact. Two sovereign entities, separated by a line, both of them recognize. 1648, Peace of Westphalia. The border becomes a legal category for the first time. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference, all of it starts here. And then Europe exported this system to the rest of the world. Not through negotiation, through conquest. In 1884, representatives of 14 nations gathered in Berlin. 13 European powers plus the United States. Their agenda? How to divide Africa among themselves without going to war with each other. No African representatives were present. Not one. They drew lines with rulers across a map. The lines ignored rivers, mountain ranges, trade routes, and, most critically, people. Communities that had lived together for centuries were split across borders. Groups that had been in conflict for generations were forced into the same colonial state. The borders that came out of that conference, and out of the broader colonial carve-up of Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific, are still there. Many of the conflicts you read about in the news today trace directly to those lines. The partition of British India in 1947, drawn in about 6 weeks by a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India, created a border that triggered one of the largest forced migrations in human history. 15 million people displaced, nearly 1 million dead. A border that ignores the people it divides isn't a solution to conflict. It's a deferred cause of it. Berlin, 1884. 14 powers, 0 Africans. Lines drawn with a ruler across a map, ignoring every river, mountain, and people. Many of today's conflicts trace directly to that room. Which brings us to the deepest question in all of this. What actually is a border? Physically, nothing. A line on a map, a sign at a checkpoint, a strip of cleared land in a forest. That's it. The border itself has no weight, no substance. You can walk through it, literally walk through it, and feel nothing. And yet, the border between the U.S. and Mexico is a line that has generated more political passion, more legislation, more rhetoric, and more human suffering than almost any other geographic fact in the Western Hemisphere. People treat it as if it were a force of nature, as if it had always been there, as if it were inevitable. It's not. Before 1848, the Rio Grande wasn't the border. Half of what is now the southwestern United States was Mexico. The line moved. And when the line moved, the people on either side of it didn't move. Their legal status just changed overnight. That's what a border really is, a collective agreement that works only as long as enough people agree to it. Draw a line in a field and declare it a border. If no one acknowledges it, it's nothing. A border exists because a critical mass of people, governments, armies, populations, have decided it exists and are prepared to enforce that decision. This makes borders one of the most powerful imaginary objects in human history, like money, like law, like a corporation. None of these things exist in nature. They exist in our collective belief. The $20 bill in your pocket is paper and ink. It's worth $20 because we all agree it is. A border is the same, a shared fiction that shapes everything. Where you were born, what language the state operates in, what rights you have, what taxes you pay, whether you can cross into the forest on the other side of those trees in the Pacific Northwest without showing documents. A border is a collective agreement, like money, like law. It exists because enough people decided it does, a shared fiction that shapes everything. Let's put the whole picture together. It started with movement. When humans moved, territory was fluid. Ranges overlapped, buffer zones shifted, nothing was fixed. No one owned the land because the land couldn't be lost. Farming stopped the movement. It created investment. Investment created the fear of loss. And the fear of loss created the first walls, literally, as in Jericho, and eventually the first political claims, as in Mesopotamia. Empires scaled this up enormously, but didn't actually create borders as we know them. They created frontiers, lines of military power, not lines of mutual sovereignty. The Middle Ages in Europe were, in a strange way, a step backward. Power defined by loyalty, not territory. Who you owed allegiance to mattered more than where you lived. 1648 created the modern framework. Sovereignty, non-interference. The border as a legal fact recognized by both sides. And then colonialism took that framework, designed by and for European states, and imposed it on the rest of the world in the least careful way imaginable. Dividing communities, forcing enemies together, creating states with no internal logic except the convenience of a colonial administrator with a ruler. The result is the map we have now. Some of those lines represent thousands of years of cultural identity, war, and negotiation. Others represent an afternoon meeting in Brussels. We call all of them borders. A few facts worth knowing before we finish. The straightest border in the world runs between the U.S. and Canada, the 49th parallel, about 2,000 kilometers of nearly perfect geometric line from the Rockies to the Pacific coast. Pure geometry. No rivers, no mountains, no historical settlement patterns. Just an agreement. Here. The most contested border is hard to choose, but Kashmir is a strong candidate. The line was drawn in 1947, in about 6 weeks. It's been the source of 3 wars and a permanent military standoff ever since. The border that exists only on paper, Antarctica. 7 countries claim territorial sectors. All of those claims are frozen, legally suspended, by the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. It's the only territory on Earth with no enforced national ownership. A border that is simultaneously real and not real. The newest border, South Sudan, which separated from Sudan in 2011. One of the youngest countries on the map. Its borders are a direct inheritance of colonial Africa, and years after independence, conflicts continue, partly because of how those borders were drawn. Every one of these is a separate story, but they all point to the same thing. We've been drawing lines for 10,000 years, and we still haven't found a system everyone accepts. Here's the closing thought. The first person who drove a stake in the ground and said, "This is mine," wasn't thinking about sovereignty. They weren't thinking about international law. They were thinking, "I planted that. My family needs it to survive the winter. Don't take it." That's all borders are at the root. A fear of loss. A claim on something you put work into. A line that says, "Here is where I end and where the unknown begins." The problem is that we scaled that personal instinct up to the size of continents and nations, and somewhere in that scaling, we forgot to ask whether the lines made sense for the people on the ground. The map of the world has never been final. It won't be final in your lifetime. Right now, somewhere, a border is being redrawn. Through war, through negotiation, through independence movements, through climate change shifting coastlines. The line in the forest is still there, but lines move. They always have.